The morning bus was running late again. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching the city slowly wake up around him. His backpack sat heavy on his lap, stuffed with sheet music that he'd been practicing for months. Today was the day. The audition that could change everything. He'd been riding the same bus for 2 years now, ever since he got the scholarship to Westwood Academy. 2 years of watching other students pull up in their parents' expensive cars while he climbed off public transport. 2 years of eating lunch alone in the practice rooms because he didn't quite fit in with the others. 2 years of proving himself in every single class, only to still feel like an outsider. The academy wasn't just any music school. It was the kind of place where famous musicians sent their kids, where having a grand piano at home was normal, where summer meant music camps in Europe, not working part-time at the corner store to help with rent. Daniel's family didn't have much. His mom worked double shifts at the hospital, and his dad drove a delivery truck 6 days a week. When he'd won the scholarship, they'd cried together in their small kitchen. His mom had held his face in her hands and told him this was his shot at a different kind of life. "Don't waste it," she'd said. "Make us proud." The scholarship covered tuition, but it didn't cover the other stuff. The fancy clothes everyone else wore, the expensive instrument accessories, the private lessons that cost more per hour than his dad made in a day. Daniel made do with what he had. He practiced on the school pianos during lunch and after hours. He studied recordings online instead of attending concerts. He wore his one good suit that his uncle had given him for his 16th birthday, even though the sleeves were getting a bit short now. As the bus finally pulled up near the academy, Daniel grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. The grand stone building always made him pause for just a second. It looked more like a palace than a school, with tall columns and carved details that must have cost a fortune. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors and into the marble hallway. Groups of students clustered near their lockers, laughing and talking about their weekends. Daniel recognized most of them from classes. There was Christopher, whose father was some famous conductor, and Victoria, who'd already performed at Carnegie Hall twice, and that whole group by the staircase who seemed to own designer everything. He kept his head down and headed toward the auditorium. The annual recital was the biggest event of the year at Westwood. Getting a solo spot meant everything. It meant recognition. It meant opportunities. It meant that maybe, just maybe, all those hours of practice in that tiny apartment had been worth it. The auditorium doors were already open. Daniel could hear piano music drifting out. Someone was warming up on stage. He recognized the piece. It was Chopin, played with technical precision but somehow lacking feeling. Still, it was good. Everyone here was good. That was the problem. He slipped into the back of the auditorium and found a seat. The schedule said he was auditioning in about 40 minutes. Enough time to get nervous. Enough time to second-guess everything. A few other students trickled in. Some he recognized, some he didn't. They all had that same look, though. Confidence. Like they belonged here. Like standing on that stage was just another Tuesday for them. Daniel envied that ease. He'd never felt it, not once in 2 years. The current audition ended, and another student took the stage. This one played violin, some complicated piece that seemed to show off every technical skill imaginable. It was impressive. They were all impressive. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He pulled out his sheet music even though he'd memorized the piece months ago. His hands were already sweating. He wiped them on his pants. The suit felt tight around his shoulders. Why had he thought this was a good idea? What made him think he could compete with these people? More students filed in as the morning went on. The seats around him filled up. He noticed a few glances his way. Nothing obvious. Just those quick looks that people give when they're sizing you up. He knew what they saw. The scholarship kid, the one who didn't quite belong. "Is that Daniel?" someone whispered a few rows back. He pretended not to hear. "I heard he's auditioning today," another voice answered. "Really? For what, piano? I guess. Should be interesting." The word interesting hung in the air with a tone that said anything but interesting, more like amusing or pathetic. Daniel's face burned, but he kept his eyes forward. 3 more auditions passed. A cellist who was technically perfect. A soprano who made the whole auditorium ring. A pianist who played with such speed and precision that it seemed almost superhuman. With each performance, Daniel felt smaller. Finally, the proctor called his name. "Daniel Reeves, to the stage, please." This was it. He stood up, legs feeling like they might give out. His backpack caught on the seat in front of him, and he had to awkwardly unhook it. A few people laughed. Not loud, just enough to hear. The walk down the aisle felt like it took forever. Every eye in the room followed him. He could feel their judgment with each step. The stage lights were bright, almost blinding after sitting in the darker audience section. The piano sat there like some beautiful, terrifying beast. A Steinway. The kind of piano he'd only dreamed of owning someday. Director Petrov sat in the third row, clipboard in hand. The man was a legend in music education. Trained in Moscow, had taught dozens of students who went on to major careers, known for being brilliant and absolutely ruthless in his critiques. He looked up as Daniel approached, his expression completely neutral. "Name and piece?" Director Petrov asked, pen poised over his clipboard. "Daniel Reeves. I'll be playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. It was an ambitious choice. Maybe too ambitious. The piece was known for destroying even experienced pianists. It required not just technical skill, but deep emotional understanding and physical endurance. Director Petrov raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. He simply waved his hand in a gesture that meant proceed. Daniel approached the piano bench. His hands were shaking now, really shaking. He tried to hide it as he adjusted the bench height. It took longer than it should have. He could hear someone shifting impatiently in their seat. A cough. A barely suppressed laugh. He sat down and placed his hands over the keys. They looked pale against the black and white. Small, almost. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember why he was here. Trying to remember all those nights at home, practicing on that cheap electronic keyboard with the sticky keys. Trying to remember his mom's face when he told her about this audition. Trying to remember what the music felt like when nobody was watching. But all he could feel was the weight of their stares. All he could hear was his own racing heartbeat. All he could think was that he didn't belong here and everyone knew it. "Whenever you're ready," Director Petrov said. His voice was flat, bored even. Daniel opened his eyes. The keys blurred slightly through unshed tears of frustration and fear. This was his moment. This was everything he'd worked for. And he was about to prove either that he belonged here or that he'd been fooling himself all along. He took one more breath and let his fingers touch the keys. The silence in the auditorium felt thick enough to choke on. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keys, frozen in that terrible moment before beginning. He could hear everything. The shuffle of someone's feet. A quiet whisper. The buzz of the overhead lights. His own breathing, too fast and too shallow. In the third row, Director Petrov glanced at his watch. It was a small gesture, but in the quiet room it might as well have been shouted through a megaphone. The message was clear. "You're wasting my time." Someone in the audience giggled. Not loud, but loud enough. Daniel's face burned hot. He knew that laugh. It belonged to Christopher, the conductor's son who'd never missed an opportunity to remind Daniel where he came from. Last month in music theory class, Christopher had made a joke about people who learned piano on toy keyboards. Everyone had laughed. The professor had pretended not to hear. "This should be good," another voice whispered from somewhere behind him. More laughter, quickly stifled, but not quite quick enough. Daniel's hands were sweating so badly now that he worried they might slip off the keys. He wiped them quickly on his pants, which only made his nervousness more obvious. The suit jacket that had seemed fine at home suddenly felt wrong. Too tight in the shoulders, too short in the sleeves. The pants sitting just a bit too high on his ankles. Next to everyone else's perfectly tailored clothes, he looked like a kid playing dress-up. "Excuse me," Director Petrov said, his accent making the words sharp and precise. "We have 17 more auditions today. If you're not prepared, we can move on." The words hit like a slap. Not prepared. After months of practice, after countless hours, after sacrificing everything to get this one shot, Daniel wanted to say something, wanted to explain that he was ready, that he just needed a moment. But his throat felt tight, and he knew if he tried to speak, his voice would crack. Victoria leaned over to her friend in the front row, not even bothering to lower her voice much. "I heard he practices on one of those plastic keyboards at home. Can you imagine?" Her friend gasped, a performative sound of shock. "You're kidding. And he's auditioning with Rachmaninoff? That's insane." "It's desperate," Victoria corrected. "He's trying to show off because he knows he can't compete otherwise." Daniel's jaw clenched. He wanted to turn around and tell them they were wrong. Tell them about the hours he'd spent studying every recording he could find. Tell them about the notebook full of notes on phrasing and dynamics. Tell them that just because he didn't have a Steinway at home didn't mean he didn't understand the music, but he didn't say any of that. Instead, he adjusted his position on the bench again, buying himself a few more seconds. His hands were still shaking. Why wouldn't they stop shaking? "Daniel," Director Petrov said, and there was warning in his voice now. "I'm going to ask you directly. Are you prepared to play today?" The question hung in the air. Daniel knew what it really meant. "Are you sure you want to embarrass yourself? Are you sure you belong here? Do you really think you can do this?" From somewhere in the middle rows, someone coughed. It sounded almost like they were covering a laugh. More whispers rippled through the audience. Daniel could feel 40 pairs of eyes on his back, all judging, all waiting for him to fail. His mind flashed to last night. He'd stayed up until 2 in the morning, going over the piece one more time on his little keyboard. The keys didn't feel right. They never did. They were too light, too plastic, not at all like the weighted keys of a real piano. But it was what he had. His mom had found it at a yard sale 3 years ago, paid $20 they couldn't really afford to spend. It had gotten him this far. He thought about his dad, who'd taken an extra shift this week so Daniel could buy new sheet music. His dad, who fell asleep at the dinner table most nights, exhausted from driving all day. His dad, who'd never said it out loud, but Daniel knew was counting on this, counting on his son to make something of himself, to have opportunities he never had. Well, Director Petrov's patience had clearly run out. He set his clipboard down with a sharp click that echoed through the room. "Perhaps you need more time to prepare. We can reschedule your audition for next semester." Next semester. The words felt like a death sentence. By next semester, all the good recital spots would be gone. By next semester, everyone would remember him as the kid who froze on stage. By next semester, he'd just be another failed scholarship student who couldn't handle the pressure. Christopher laughed outright now, not even bothering to hide it. "This is painful to watch," he said to the person next to him. Something in Daniel snapped, not in an angry way, but in a clarifying way. He suddenly saw the situation clearly. These people had already decided he didn't belong. They'd decided it the day he walked through the doors 2 years ago. Nothing he could say would change their minds. The only thing that would change their minds was the music. He placed his hands back on the keys. The expensive polish on the Steinway felt smooth under his fingers, so different from the plastic he was used to. For a second, the difference terrified him. What if he couldn't adjust? What if his months of practice on inferior instruments had prepared him for the wrong thing? But then he pressed down slightly, just testing the resistance. The keys felt heavy, real, responsive. They felt like possibility. Director Petrov sighed, a long theatrical sound of disappointment. He picked his clipboard back up, probably to make a note. Probably something about wasting time or lack of professionalism. Daniel could imagine what would be written there. Unprepared, nervous, not ready for this level of performance. In the front row, Victoria had her phone out, probably texting someone about the entertainment of watching the scholarship kid fall apart. The person next to her was smiling, that mean sort of smile that people get when they're enjoying someone else's misery. Daniel closed his eyes. He shut out the auditorium, shut out the whispers and the judgment and the expensive clothes and the confident faces. He shut out Director Petrov and his disappointment. He shut out Christopher's laughter and Victoria's phone and every single person who'd ever looked at him like he didn't belong. In his mind, he was back in his apartment, in that tiny room he shared with his younger brother, where they'd hung a blanket to divide the space, where his keyboard sat on a folding table that wobbled if you played too hard, where the neighbors upstairs sometimes banged on the floor if he practiced too late, where his mom would stand in the doorway sometimes just listening, with tears in her eyes that she'd quickly wipe away before he noticed. He thought about why he'd chosen this piece, not to show off like Victoria had said, but because it meant something. Rachmaninoff wrote it during one of the hardest periods of his life. After a failure that had nearly destroyed him, it was music born from pain and struggle and the desperate need to prove something, not just to others but to himself. Daniel understood that feeling. He'd been living it for 2 years. The first note came out softer than he'd planned. His hands were still shaking and you could hear it in the sound. Someone in the audience snorted. Great start, he could imagine them thinking. This is going to be a disaster. But Daniel didn't stop. He pressed into the second note and the third. The opening of the piece was meant to be quiet, haunting. His hands found the pattern they'd practiced 1,000 times. The muscle memory took over where his conscious mind was too scared to go. The whispers in the audience didn't stop immediately. Someone was still talking. Something about this being a waste of time. Director Petrov was writing something on his clipboard, probably already composing his rejection in his head. But Daniel kept playing. The notes came faster now, building. His right hand climbed up the keyboard while his left held the rhythm steady. The shaking in his hands started to ease as the music took over. He could feel the difference in these keys, the way they responded to pressure, the way the sound rang out clear and true instead of the tinny electronic version he was used to. Measure by measure, something was shifting. The music was reaching into that place where he stored all his frustration and fear and anger at being looked down on. Every time someone had laughed at his cheap clothes. Every time he'd been excluded from study groups. Every time he'd eaten alone. Every time he'd felt like an imposter in this building. It was all going into the music now. His body started to move with the playing naturally without thinking about it. His shoulders swayed. His back curved. This was how music was supposed to be played, not rigid and scared, but alive. The piece had a moment where both hands had to cross over each other in this complicated pattern. He'd messed it up hundreds of times in practice. His too light keyboard hadn't prepared him for the weight of real keys. But somehow on this piano his hands knew what to do. They found their way across each other, the notes tumbling out in a cascade that actually sounded like music instead of practice. And that's when Daniel realized something. The auditorium had gotten quiet. Really quiet. The whispers had stopped. The silence was different now. Daniel could feel it even with his eyes closed, even while his hands moved across the keys. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before, filled with mockery and impatience. This was the silence of people actually listening. His fingers found their way into the heart of the piece where Rachmaninoff's genius really showed itself. The melody line wove between his hands like a conversation between two souls. His left hand provided the foundation, steady and strong, while his right hand soared above it, telling a story of struggle and beauty intertwined. This was the section he'd worried about most. On his little keyboard at home, it always sounded choppy, disconnected. The cheap speakers couldn't capture the resonance, the way one note should blend into the next. But here on this magnificent piano, the sound was alive. Each note rang out into the space, mixing with the ones before it, creating something richer than just individual sounds. Daniel's eyes were still closed, but in his mind he could see the music. He'd studied the score so many times that he'd memorized not just the notes but the structure, the architecture of it. He understood why Rachmaninoff had chosen this chord progression, why this particular rhythm, why this exact dynamic marking. It all made sense in a way that went beyond technical knowledge. He leaned into a particularly intense phrase, his whole body rocking slightly with the force of it. The piano responded beautifully, the sound swelling to fill every corner of the auditorium. This was what he'd imagined during all those late-night practice sessions. This was what he'd heard in his head but could never quite produce on inadequate equipment. The piece moved into its faster section, where most pianists showed off their speed and precision. Daniel had watched countless videos of professionals playing this part, their fingers a blur on the keys. He'd been terrified of it for weeks, convinced he'd never get it up to tempo, never make it sound fluid instead of frantic. But something had changed. Maybe it was the piano itself with its perfect action and responsiveness. Maybe it was the months of grueling practice finally paying off. Or maybe it was simply that for the first time in 2 years, he'd stopped caring what everyone thought and started caring only about the music. His hands flew across the keys. The notes came so fast they almost overlapped, creating this rushing waterfall of sound. His left hand pounded out the bass line while his right hand danced through the treble. He could feel his heart racing, could feel the sweat on his forehead, could feel every muscle in his arms working. In the audience, Christopher had stopped laughing. "Hey, though." At forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open. This wasn't supposed to happen. The scholarship kid wasn't supposed to be good. He was supposed to embarrass himself, give them all something to laugh about later in the cafeteria. Victoria had put her phone away. Her fingers gripped the armrest of her seat. She'd played this piece herself last year, had spent 6 months on it with her private teacher who charged $200 an hour. She'd performed it at a competition and placed third. But listening now, she realized something unsettling. This boy she'd dismissed as beneath her notice was playing it better than she had. Not just technically better, though his technique was flawless, but better in the way that actually mattered. He understood the music. Director Petrov's pen had stopped moving. He sat perfectly still, his clipboard forgotten in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the stage. In 30 years of teaching, he'd heard this piece performed hundreds of times. By students with every advantage. By professionals at concerts. By competition winners and prodigies. And this performance by a nervous kid in an ill-fitting suit was touching something he thought he'd lost years ago. It was reminding him why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Daniel moved into the middle section, where the piece became introspective and tender. His touch lightened. The notes came softer now, more delicate. This was the part that required not strength but control, not speed but sensitivity. Each note needed to be perfect, not in a technical sense, but in an emotional one. He thought about his mom as he played this section, about the way she'd hum while doing dishes, always slightly off-key but full of joy. About the way she'd sacrificed so much for him and his brother, working those terrible hours so they could have opportunities she never had. About the way she'd told him just that morning, "You're going to be amazing today. I believe in you." The music carried all of that. Every quiet note was an act of love and gratitude. Every gentle phrase was a promise to make all the sacrifice worthwhile. Someone in the audience made a small sound, almost like a gasp. Daniel didn't hear it consciously, but somewhere deep down he registered that people were feeling what he was feeling. The music was connecting, bridging that gap between the stage and the seats, between his experience and theirs. The piece started building again. Rachmaninoff was a master of structure, of taking listeners on a journey. The music climbed and climbed, getting louder and more intense. Daniel's hands spread wide across the keyboard, hitting notes at opposite ends, creating this huge, expansive sound. His arms ached. His back ached. His fingers were starting to tire. But he pushed through it. This was the climax of the piece, the moment everything had been building toward. He couldn't hold back now. He gave it everything he had. The sound filled the auditorium like a living thing. It was big and bold and unapologetic. It was the sound of someone refusing to be invisible anymore, of someone demanding to be heard, to be taken seriously, to be recognized for what they could do rather than dismissed for what they didn't have. In that moment, Daniel wasn't the poor kid on scholarship. He wasn't the outsider in the second-hand suit. He wasn't the target of whispers and mockery. He was a musician, pure and simple. He was an artist speaking a universal language that transcended money and status and background. The music teacher from Daniel's high school had told him once that great performers don't just play notes on a page. They tell stories. They share something true about being human. At the time, Daniel hadn't fully understood, but he understood now. He was sharing his story. The story of feeling overlooked and underestimated. The story of working twice as hard for half the recognition. The story of proving yourself over and over only to still be doubted. But also the story of persistence. Of refusing to give up. Of believing in yourself even when nobody else does. Of finding beauty and meaning in struggle. The piece began its descent from the climax. The notes came fast and furious, cascading down the keyboard in patterns that looked impossible on the page. Daniel's hands knew what to do. They'd practiced this transition so many times that conscious thought wasn't needed anymore. His body had learned the language of this music. A door at the back of the auditorium opened quietly. Professor Martinez, who taught advanced composition, had been walking past when she heard the music. She'd stepped inside, just planning to listen for a moment. Now she stood frozen, unable to leave. She pulled out her phone and quickly texted her colleague. "You need to get to the auditorium." Right now, more faculty started arriving. They slipped in through the back doors, drawn by the extraordinary performance echoing through the hallways. Word was spreading. Professor Kim from the strings department, Professor Johnson from music history. Even the dean of students, who rarely attended auditions, appeared in the doorway. Daniel knew none of this. His world had narrowed to just him and the piano and the music. Nothing else existed. Not the audience, not the judgment, not his fears or doubts. Just the pure act of making something beautiful. The piece moved through its final variations. Daniel's hands crossed and recrossed, his fingers finding notes with absolute certainty. The keyboard was an extension of himself now. There was no gap between thought and sound, between intention and execution. He'd become a channel for the music to flow through. His technique was flawless, but that wasn't what made the performance special. Plenty of pianists had flawless technique. What made it special was the absolute honesty of it. Every note was true. Nothing was performed for effect or show. It was just pure, unfiltered musical expression. Christopher sat back in his seat, feeling something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Shame, maybe, or recognition that he'd been wrong. He'd spent 2 years dismissing this kid, making jokes about him, treating him like he didn't matter. And the whole time, this talent had been there. This incredible gift that made Christopher's own carefully cultivated abilities seem hollow by comparison. Victoria felt tears prickling at her eyes, which shocked her. She didn't cry at performances. She prided herself on being analytical, critical, able to spot every small mistake. But there were no mistakes here. Or maybe there were. Tiny technical imperfections that didn't matter at all because the whole was so much greater than any individual part. Director Petrov's hands had started to tremble slightly. He gripped his clipboard to steady them. He'd been teaching long enough to become cynical, to see music as a technical skill to be measured and graded. But this performance was stripping that cynicism away, reminding him of when he was young and every piece of music felt like a miracle. Daniel pressed into the final section. His entire body was engaged now, his foot on the sustain pedal controlling the resonance, his shoulders and back providing power, his wrists loose and flexible, his fingers precise and sure, everything working together in perfect coordination. The music built one last time to a powerful statement. Bold chords that rang out with absolute confidence. This was the ending. This was the final declaration. He played it with everything he had left, holding nothing back. The final notes echoed through the auditorium, hanging in the air like something physical you could reach out and touch. Daniel's hands remained on the keys for a moment, feeling the vibration of the strings still resonating inside the piano. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. He felt emptied out, like he'd poured every emotion he'd ever had into those last 10 minutes. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hands and placed them in his lap. They were shaking again, but for a different reason now. Not from fear, but from the sheer physical and emotional exhaustion of what he'd just done. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Sweat trickled down his back under the suit jacket. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The silence was complete and absolute. Daniel sat frozen at the piano, terrified to turn around and see their faces. What if they'd hated it? What if he'd messed something up that he hadn't noticed? What if he'd been feeling something the music didn't actually convey? His mind started racing through everything he'd just played, searching for mistakes. Had he rushed that one passage? Was the dynamic contrast in the middle section enough? Did he hold that pause too long? Then he heard it. A single sound breaking the silence. The slow, deliberate clap of hands meeting. Then another. And another. The sound coming from the direction of the judges' seats. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see Director Petrov, the stern Russian professor who'd sighed with impatience just minutes ago. The man known for crushing students' dreams with a single cutting comment. He was standing now, his hands coming together in steady, measured applause. And his face. The expression on Director Petrov's face made something catch in Daniel's throat. There were tears streaming down the old professor's cheeks. Not just wet eyes, but actual tears running into his gray beard. His mouth was set in a line, but his eyes were soft, full of something Daniel had never seen there before. Respect. Recognition. Maybe even awe. The rest of the auditorium erupted. It was like Director Petrov's standing ovation had broken a dam. Suddenly everyone was on their feet. The sound of applause crashed over Daniel in waves, so loud it was almost shocking after the quiet intensity of the performance. Christopher was standing, his hands coming together hard enough that it must have hurt. His face was red and he wasn't looking at Daniel but at the floor, like he couldn't quite meet his eyes. But he was clapping, really clapping, not just going through the motions. Victoria had her hand over her mouth, tears running down her perfectly made-up face. She was nodding almost to herself as she applauded, like she was acknowledging something she hadn't wanted to admit before. All around the auditorium, students who'd whispered and laughed were now standing and clapping. Some looked stunned. Some were wiping their eyes. Some were turning to each other with expressions of disbelief, like they couldn't quite process what they'd just witnessed. But it was the faculty members gathering at the back that really drove home what had happened. Professor Martinez had her phone out recording now, capturing the standing ovation. Professor Kim was shaking her head slowly, a huge smile on her face. The dean stood with his arms crossed, nodding with satisfaction like he'd known all along this kid had it in him, though they all knew he hadn't. Daniel stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. He felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the response. He'd expected polite applause at best, maybe some acknowledgement that he'd gotten through the piece without completely falling apart. He hadn't expected this. This felt like something else entirely. Director Petrov was walking toward the stage. The applause continued but quieted slightly as people watched to see what the notoriously tough director would say. He climbed the steps slowly, his age showing in the careful way he moved. When he reached Daniel, he stopped just a foot away, studying his face. Up close, the tears on Petrov's face were even more visible. The old man reached out and gripped Daniel's shoulder. His hand was strong, firm. Not a congratulatory pat, but a real grip, like he was anchoring himself to something solid. "In my 30 years at this academy," Petrov said, his accent thick with emotion, "I have heard thousands of auditions, thousands of technically perfect performances by students with every advantage." He paused, his hand tightening on Daniel's shoulder. "But what you just did, young man, that was not an audition. That was art." The auditorium had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear what the director was saying. "You made me feel something I had forgotten I could feel," Petrov continued. His voice cracked slightly. "You reminded me why I became a teacher, why I dedicated my life to music, not for perfect technique, not for flawless execution, but for this. For the moment when someone takes notes on a page and transforms them into truth." Daniel's eyes were burning now. He tried to blink the tears back but couldn't. They spilled over, running down his face. He didn't even try to hide them. "I was wrong to doubt you," Petrov said more quietly. "Meant just for Daniel. I judged you before you played a single note. That is my failure, not yours. You have taught me something today. Thank you." The director held out his hand. Daniel took it, feeling the calluses on Petrov's fingers, the marks of a lifetime spent at the piano. They shook hands firmly and then Petrov pulled him into an embrace. It was brief but genuine. When he stepped back, the old man was smiling through his tears. The applause started up again, even louder than before. Petrov turned to face the audience, still gripping Daniel's hand, and raised their joined hands into the air like a referee declaring a winner. The cheering intensified. Daniel looked out at the sea of faces. Students he'd felt invisible to for 2 years were looking at him like they were seeing him for the first time. And maybe they were. Maybe he'd been invisible because he'd been trying so hard to blend in, to not make waves, to just survive. But the music had made him visible in a way that nothing else could. As the applause continued, other faculty members came up on stage. Professor Martinez reached him first. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her personality filled any room she entered. "I recorded the last 2 minutes," she said, holding up her phone. "I hope you don't mind. That needs to be preserved. That's the kind of performance people need to hear." Professor Kim, the strings teacher, was next. "My students could learn something from what you just did. It's not about the instrument you have or the training you've received. It's about connection. You connected with that piece on a level that can't be taught." The dean waited until the other professors had finished, then stepped forward. He was a large man with a commanding presence, known for running the academy with strict efficiency. Daniel had only spoken to him once briefly at freshman orientation. "Daniel Reeves," the dean said, his voice carrying authority. "I'm going to be honest with you. When I saw your name on the audition list, I didn't recognize it. I'm ashamed to admit I had to look up your file. Do you know what I found?" Daniel shook his head, not trusting his voice. Perfect attendance. Top grades in every music class. Practice room logs showing you here until closing time nearly every day. Letters from your instructors noting your dedication and improvement. And I realized something. The dean paused, making sure everyone was listening. We almost missed you. This academy almost failed to recognize the remarkable talent and dedication standing right in front of us. That changes today. He turned to address the whole auditorium. The spring recital will feature Daniel Reeves in a solo performance. Not as an opening act, not as a filler, but as the centerpiece of the evening. More applause, louder now mixed with some cheers. Daniel felt like he might pass out. The centerpiece of the spring recital was usually reserved for seniors, for students who'd already made names for themselves. It was the most prestigious spot, the one that agents and scouts attended specifically to see. But that's not all, the dean continued. I'm also establishing a new practice scholarship. Daniel will have unlimited access to our best instruments, including the Concert Hall Steinway, for private practice outside of class hours. Daniel's knees almost gave out. The Concert Hall Steinway was the crown jewel of the Academy's collection, worth more than his parents made in 5 years. Students had to book it months in advance, and even then only got an hour at a time. Unlimited access was unheard of. Additionally, the dean said, clearly enjoying the moment, I'll be personally contacting some colleagues about private instruction opportunities. Your talent deserves nurturing, Daniel. Real nurturing. From the best teachers in the field. The implication was clear. Private lessons. The kind that cost thousands of dollars. The kind Daniel could never have afforded. Being offered for free, probably, or covered by some discretionary fund the dean had access to. Victoria pushed through the crowd gathering at the front of the stage. Her makeup was smudged from crying, and she looked embarrassed but determined. She stood in front of Daniel, fidgeting with her expensive bracelet. I need to apologize, she said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. I said some really horrible things about you. Before and during your audition, I was wrong. Completely wrong. You're incredibly talented, and I let my own insecurity make me cruel. She took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, Daniel didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her exactly how much her words had hurt. But looking at her now, genuinely remorseful and vulnerable, he just nodded. Thank you for saying that. Christopher appeared next, looking even more uncomfortable than Victoria. His confidence had always seemed unshakable, but now he looked like a kid who'd been caught doing something wrong. Man, I've been a complete jerk to you, he said, running his hand through his hair. For 2 years. I made fun of you because I was scared, I guess. Scared that someone without all the advantages I have could be better than me. And you are. Better than me, I mean. That was incredible. Daniel stood there as more students approached, each offering congratulations or apologies or simple expressions of amazement. It felt surreal, like he'd stepped into someone else's life. Just 15 minutes ago, he'd been the invisible scholarship kid. Now he was surrounded by people treating him like he mattered. But the strangest part was how it made him feel. Not triumphant exactly, though there was some of that. Not vindicated, though he'd certainly proved something. Mostly he just felt tired, and surprisingly a little sad, because he realized that he'd had this ability all along. The talent, the dedication, the understanding of music that had just brought an entire auditorium to tears. It had always been there. But he'd been so busy trying to survive, so focused on just getting through each day without being noticed or mocked, that he'd hidden himself. What would the last 2 years have been like if he'd played like that from the beginning? If he'd let people see what he was capable of instead of trying to stay small and safe? The crowd around him was starting to thin as students filed out to their next classes. The audition schedule was hopelessly behind now. Several students who'd been scheduled after Daniel had left, probably realizing that following that performance would be impossible. Nobody would remember what came after. Director Petrov approached again, this time with a folder in his hands. A moment of your time, he said, gesturing Daniel toward the side of the stage. They walked over to where it was quieter. Petrov opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. These are recommendation letters I've written for various students over the years. For competitions, for scholarships, for prestigious summer programs. He looked at Daniel seriously. I want you to know that I don't write these lightly. My name in something in this field. And I don't attach it to students unless I truly believe in them. Daniel nodded, not sure where this was going. I would like to write one for you. Petrov continued. There's a summer intensive at Juilliard. It's incredibly competitive. Last year, they accepted only 20 students from around the world. But I think with my recommendation and a recording of today's performance, you would have a genuine chance. Juilliard. The word hung in the air like something precious and fragile. It was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Students who went there went on to solo careers, to orchestras, to stages Daniel had only dreamed about. I don't know if I could afford it, Daniel said quietly. Even if I got in? It's a full scholarship program, Petrov replied. Room, board, instruction, everything covered. That's specifically why I think you should apply. They look for talent, not bank accounts. Hope fluttered in Daniel's chest, dangerous and bright. I'd need to talk to my parents. Of course, but Daniel. Petrov put his hand on the young man's shoulder again. I need you to understand something. What you did today was not lucky. It was not a fluke. You have a genuine gift, a rare one. The kind that comes along perhaps once in a generation. And with proper training, proper opportunities, you could go as far as you want in this field. But I don't have proper training, Daniel said. I've never had private lessons. I learned from library books and YouTube videos. My keyboard at home has broken keys. I know, Petrov said gently, and that makes what you accomplished even more remarkable. You're like a plant that grew through concrete. Imagine what you could do with actual soil and sunlight, with the resources you deserve. The metaphor hit Daniel hard. That's exactly what he'd felt like. Something trying to grow in impossible conditions, pushing through barriers that should have stopped him. I'll apply, he said. Thank you. Petrov smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face. Good. Come to my office tomorrow. We'll discuss your application and record a proper performance for submission. As the director walked away, Professor Martinez approached. I hope it's okay that I recorded that last bit, she said. It was just too good not to capture. I promise I won't share it anywhere without your permission. It's fine, Daniel said. He was still processing everything. His brain felt fuzzy, overwhelmed. Listen, she said, her tone becoming more serious. You're going to get a lot of attention now. Today changed things for you. People are going to treat you differently. Some will be genuine, but others will want to attach themselves to your success. Be careful about that, okay? It was good advice, though it was hard to imagine right now. He'd spent so long being ignored that the idea of people wanting to be associated with him seemed impossible. Also, she continued, don't let this change your relationship with music. What made that performance special was the honesty of it. The way you played for the right reasons. As you get more opportunities, it's going to be tempting to start playing for applause, for recognition, for career advancement. Those things aren't bad, but they can't be the core of why you do this. Remember how you felt up there today. Hold on to that. Daniel nodded, committing her words to memory. He had a feeling he'd need to remember them later. The auditorium was nearly empty now. Just a few faculty members chatting near the exit, and the student workers starting to set up for the next scheduled event. Daniel gathered his backpack, which he'd left under his seat. His hands were still trembling slightly from adrenaline. He walked out into the hallway, and the normal sounds of the academy washed over him. Lockers slamming, voices echoing, someone practicing scales in a distant room. But everything felt different now, like the building itself had changed around him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his mom. How did it go? Been thinking about you all morning. Daniel stared at the message, trying to figure out how to respond. How could he possibly explain what had just happened in a text message? He settled for simple. Really well. I'll tell you everything when I get home. 3 dots appeared immediately as she typed. I knew you would do great. So proud of you, baby. He smiled, feeling tears prick his eyes again. He needed to get himself together. He still had music theory class in 20 minutes. As he walked down the hallway, something strange started happening. People were looking at him, not with the quick dismissive glances he was used to, but with actual recognition. A girl from his music history class waved at him. 2 guys he'd never spoken to nodded as they passed. A freshman literally stopped walking to stare at him. Word had spread fast. Of course it had. In a school this size, where drama and gossip were currency, an audition like his would be the talk of the campus within an hour. He reached his locker and started swapping out books. Someone cleared their throat behind him. He turned to find a group of 3 students, all seniors he recognized but had never talked to. Hey, said one of them, a tall girl with short hair. We heard what happened in the auditorium. That's amazing. Thanks. Daniel said, not sure what else to say. We're having a practice session tonight in the jazz studio, she continued. Just jamming, trying out new stuff. You should come, if you want. An invitation, a real one. Not offered out of pity or obligation, but genuine interest. 2 years he'd been here, and this was the first time someone had invited him to anything social. I'd like that, he said. What time? 7. We usually go until they kick us out. She smiled. I'm Rachel, by the way. This is Tom and Jesse, Daniel. We know, Tom said with a grin. Everyone knows now. They chatted for a minute more before heading off to class. Daniel closed his locker and leaned against it for a moment, trying to process the fact that he'd just been invited to a jam session, that people wanted to play music with him. Music theory class was different too. Professor Williams stopped him at the door. Heard you had quite the audition this morning. Word travels fast, Daniel said. In this building, always. The professor studied him for a moment. I've had you in class for 2 semesters now. You've always been one of my best students, but you've also been quiet, reserved. I'm glad you're finally letting people see what you can do. During class, Daniel caught people looking at him, not unkindly but with curiosity, with interest. When the professor asked a question about chord progressions, hands shot up, but then people glanced at Daniel like they wanted to hear what he thought. At lunch, he walked into the cafeteria expecting to head to his usual spot in the corner, but Rachel waved him over to where she sat with a large group of students. He hesitated only a moment before joining them. The conversation was easy, welcoming. They talked about music and classes and the upcoming recital. They asked his opinion on things. They listened when he spoke. It was such a simple thing being included in a conversation, but it filled something in Daniel that had been empty for a long time. So what made you choose that piece? Jesse asked. Rachmaninoff is intense. Daniel thought about how to answer. I guess I connected with it. It was written during a hard time in his life. After a failure that almost destroyed his confidence. I understood that feeling. The table got quiet. Then Rachel spoke. We all did, honestly. Watching you play, it was clear you weren't just playing notes. You were telling a story. Your story. That's what made it powerful, Tom added. Technical skill is impressive, but emotion is what makes music matter. The afternoon flew by. Daniel went to his remaining classes, practiced for an hour in one of the small studios, and then headed to the jazz practice room at 7. The session was incredible. They played for 3 hours, trying different arrangements, improvising, laughing when things went wrong and cheering when they came together right. Daniel discovered he was pretty good at jazz piano, something he'd never really tried before. His classical training gave him a foundation, but jazz required different thinking. More freedom, more risk. He loved it. When he finally got home around 11, exhausted and happy, his family was waiting up. His mom, dad, and younger brother all sitting in the living room despite the late hour. Tell us everything, his mom demanded. So he did. He told them about the nerves and the mockery and the moment he'd almost given up. He told them about the performance, about how the music had taken over, about the standing ovation and Director Petrov's tears. He told them about the apologies and the opportunities and the invitation to Juilliard's summer program. His mom cried. His dad kept shaking his head in amazement. His brother, who was 13 and usually too cool to show emotion, looked at him with something like awe. We always knew you had it in you, his dad said, his voice thick. We just hoped someone else would finally see it too. Later, lying in bed in the room he shared with his brother, Daniel stared at the ceiling. The day felt like a dream, like something that had happened to someone else. But his arms ached from playing. His emotions felt raw and exposed. It had been real. Tomorrow everything would be different. He'd walk into that building as someone people recognized, someone they respected. He'd have opportunities he'd never imagined. He'd have a path forward that seemed suddenly clear and bright. But tonight, in the dark of his small room, Daniel just felt grateful. Grateful that he hadn't given up, that he'd found the courage to play his truth despite the fear. That music had been the Brady.